הנה מה טוב ומנועים שבשחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב ומנועים שבשחים גם יוחד.
Hi, and welcome to Jewish Insights. In Stephen Covey's famous book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he lays out 4 different categories. That which is important, that which is not important, that which is urgent, and that which is not urgent. Since October 7th, certainly for the Jewish community, thinking about anti-Semitism and what's happening in Israel has been both important and urgent. But often, when we get focused on what's important and urgent, sometimes we lose sight of what's important and not urgent. And when I say what's important and not urgent, one thing I'm thinking about today is the future. Not the future 5 months from now, not the future a year from now, but what does the future look like 10, 20, in the year 2050? What does the world look like? What does the Jewish world look like? And how might Judaism contribute to the conversation about that? I have a memory as a child of watching the film Junior in 1994, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Danny DeVito, and Emma Thompson. And in that movie, I remember Arnold Schwarzenegger is somehow impregnated and carries a baby. And I remember being young and saying, wow, maybe one day when I'm older, I'll carry a baby. And I think that gave a taste of like kind of when you're young and you think about the future and what it might be. And perhaps I haven't kept up with the science. Maybe that's something that's being developed still. I don't know. But certainly something that stuck with me. And I remember even more particularly when I was in college at the Annenberg Center at Penn, having a professor, Dr. Paul Massaris, may his memory be a blessing, and him kind of laying out that if you look at different directors of sci-fi movies, often they start with a uplifting, rosy view of the future when they're younger, and later in their career it sometimes gets a little bit darker. And the example that comes to mind was Steven Spielberg. So the movie E.T., when it came out, kind of was this uplifting view of what the future or aliens or what the world might look like, or extraterrestrials. And then later in his career he had the movie Minority Report, which was a much darker take on what the future might look like. And so Dr. Massaris at the time kind of opined that perhaps as we get older, we develop a darker sense of what the future looks like. When we're young, 100 years from now is I'm going to live forever and the world's going to be perfect and everything's going to be great with all the technology. And as we get older, sometimes we lean more into fear about the future, concern about the future, a sense of darkness. And so I go between those places today. We'll discuss it a little bit more. But before we do that, I really want to introduce our guest, David Zvi Kalman, who's here with us today. I'm super excited. He's a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, which is where we first met. He wrote his dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania on the relationship between Jewish history and the history of technology. Hopefully he'll share a little bit with us today around the relationship between those two. And he continues to write widely on Judaism and artificial intelligence. He's the owner of Printercraft Press, and you can read him regularly on his substack, which is called Jello Menorah. And if you don't know what a Jello Menorah is, imagine it, as he says. So first of all, welcome. I'm so happy you're here, David Zvi.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really a pleasure. And I know this is an area that, they talk about the water cooler. I remember when we were both at the Hartman Institute, this is an area that I was always popping into your office to get your views on, because I respect your views a lot, and it's an area that I'm very interested in. So it's really a schut, a merit for me to have you here today.
It's great to be here.
So let's start with we'll start big. You've used the language Jewish futurism. I was going to introduce you as a Jewish futurist, but I didn't want to put labels on you, but let's call you a Jewish futurist or a futurist.
I'll take it.
The Jewish futurist. David Zvi, what do you mean when you say Jewish futurism? What are we talking about?
So I think, very simply, Jewish futurism is the idea that we are closer to the beginning of Jewish history than to its end, which I think is...
Wait, slow down. That's a lot right there.
It's hard.
We are closer to the beginning... We are closer to the beginning of Jewish history than the end.
That's right.
Right. Okay. So first of all, that's not how I think at all, if we're being honest, right? There's this sense that, like all of these things have happened, and we're close to Mashiach, but like all the things that happened have already happened. And you're saying the reverse. You're saying like we're in chapter 3 of 100 chapters here. We're earlier or somewhere earlier.
It's hard to imagine, right? Jewish history already occupies most of recorded history, and imagining that this could just be the beginning of something seems kind of outlandish. But the truth of the matter is, we're at a moment in human history where people are starting to look about those long spans of time. We're imagining, what does it mean to be a human being on this planet, not just the next decade, century, but the kinds of innovations that we're developing right now are going to have impact on us for a very long time to come. And there's no reason to think that Jewish history won't be along for the ride and that we can't actually be integral and important pieces of developing that future as it emerges. I think we will be. And so 3,000 years might seem like, how could you imagine a history that's 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 years? But I think this is actually precisely the moment to align our understanding of Jewish history with the understanding of human history as it's emerging right now.
Why is this the moment?
It's the moment because there's something that's happened in the last 150 years or so. There's a scholar named Brad DeLong who's kind of written about how the last 130, 140 years are unique in human history in terms of how fast things have developed. It's not just about the Industrial Revolution, it's about how technologies have been implemented widely in society over a matter of decades, sometimes even years, right? Think about how long it's been from the advent of the iPhone to the iPhone being everywhere. And think about all the technologies that are like that. That is new. Think about the rise of artificial intelligence, the rise of new kinds of medicines, the rise of virtual reality. In so many different spaces, we are developing technologies that are going to radically transform the world. It's also true in a negative direction, right? Climate change is rapidly changing the planet in all kinds of very dangerous and very scary ways. But in both of those directions, I think we are imagining humanity as having this long horizon and are able to think about it in terms that maybe we would not have even a few decades ago.
That's interesting. So I'll pick a couple things out of there. So I hear what you're saying a little bit around it just accelerating so quickly right now that's why it feels so urgent. I guess you could argue the 80s were so fast, the 90s were so fast, but I guess we're saying it's getting faster and faster. But I think often a narrative we hear also is like, especially you brought up climate change, it's accelerating so fast and it's going to be gone so soon. But you're saying it's accelerating so fast and it's going to keep accelerating so fast. But we need to, by moving it an inch to the left or the right, we have to make sure it accelerates to here and not there. Is that what you're saying?
I think we're trying, right? We're trying to both mitigate the effects of climate disasters and also try to live on a planet that will be rapidly changing. But I think the question is actually the reverse. It's not a question of why is the rest of the world thinking this way? It's why within Jewish thought right now is it so hard to imagine the next 100, 200, 300,000 years? Why are we interested in kind of looking back towards our past more than thinking more towards our future, which is the mindset that I think we're in right now.
Right. I guess as someone who probably lands in that bucket often, I guess my first thought would be, well, we have this winning recipe that all the crazy things that have happened in the world, somehow we're still here despite those changes. So if we stick to Shabbat, if we stick to Kashrut, if we stick to community, if we stick to believing in God and Tefillah and all those things that whatever peaks and valleys come around the world around us, we hold on to our thing and serve as that model of how to live a certain life. So let's not get swept up in the speed of everything around us. Let's kind of stick to our recipe. And I would say alongside that is a sense that those who do get swept up in what's going on around us often, we don't see them in the Jewish world necessarily many decades down the road.
Yeah. So that winning recipe is nothing to sneeze at, certainly. The long history of Judaism and the fact that we kind of keep referring back to it, it's not just like a number, but actually you have Batei Midrash, study halls, where people are regularly in conversation with texts from the entire range of that history. That's not a small thing. At the same time, you can't kind of rest on your laurels. The fact that that history exists doesn't mean that you can kind of say well, we clearly have something and everything will be fine for the foreseeable future. I think it's exactly the opposite. It's a little bit like, let's say you have a company that has been in business, has been doing well for decades, maybe a century or more. That doesn't mean the next year is automatically going to be okay. In fact, it actually means you have more pressure to make sure that whatever kind of innovative things you've been doing, whatever kind of important strategic work has been going on the whole time, continues in that vein. And so it tells us what we ought to be doing in the future, but it doesn't mean that we're kind of safe and things are going to be okay going forward. It actually is a kind of mandate to continue innovating and to continue doing new and important work in the future.
So I'm going to push you on a little bit further and then I'll let you go, which is, I know you're a historian of Jewish history and technological history. And so when I think about, let's call it the Jewish resistance, cars arrive and we say we're not going to do that in Shabbat. Phones arrive, we say we're not going to do that in Shabbat. We don't say we're not going to do that technology, although some communities certainly say, no iPhones or no that kind of thing. But it does feel like part of our success has come with some resistance to technology and not kind of let's jump on the technology bandwagon as soon as it arrives. So Where's the daylight between those then?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that in general, you can say that Jews have basically had the same kind of positions as everyone else around new technologies. You can't say that Jews overall are more for technology, less for technology, but there are certain areas of Jewish life, I think Shabbat's the most important one, where Jews kind of enter the picture with a clear sense of this is what we want this day to look like. We want Shabbat to feel a certain way, and that varies a little bit between communities. Some communities, have a Shabbat where there really are no cars at all. Mm-hmm. Some communities accept that. Some have experiences of Shabbat where there's a certain amount of electricity or not. But because you kind of enter that conversation with a kernel of this is what I want the day to look like, when the new technology comes down the road, even if it's one you've never seen before, you kind of have a gut instinct of, does this fit or not? Mm. I think that happened with electricity in a really strong way. Electricity kind of comes into homes in the 19th century. Originally, it's a kind of novelty. Eventually, it becomes kind of important for lighting and then other devices. The truth of the matter is, there never really has been a strong reason within Jewish law to say no electricity. The reasons continue to be remarkably weak, and yet, electricity is really understood to be dangerous as part of a Shabbat environment because along with electricity comes all of the many other things that are part of a modern life. Television and all kinds of electronics and transportation for many communities. So there is that kind of innate sense out of a lived experience of we know what we want Shabbat to look like, and we know that this does not fit. But what I love about that is it's not just saying yes or no. It also is about these kind of in-between steps. For example, there's this thing called a Shabbat lamp, which in Orthodox communities is this very odd device that's like, it's a lamp, it's on Shabbat, it's on all the time, and you just have a kind of screen that you rotate to make it seem like it's turning on or off. Now, if you're an outsider looking at a device like this, you're thinking like, this is insane. Why wouldn't you just turn it on or off? Who cares? But for the people who are inside of those experiences, there's a sense of, this is just different enough for me to feel like it is not breaking my experience of Shabbat. And that sense of innovation that comes out of this internalized sense of, I know what I want Shabbat to look like, it's not just about yes or no, it's also about actually creating new things. I think it's a really good example of the way that Judaism can meet technology and meet the modern world, not just as a kind of participant or resistor, but also as a developer.
So I hear you saying a few things there. One is, which is very powerful, I hadn't thought of it that way, which is, often I joke that any current event thing that happens, people who have their existing cause, come after it. So let's say, God forbid, we have, one of these school shootings. The people who have opinions about gun control, this is a gun control story. And the people who have opinions about mental health, this is a mental health story. And the people who have opinions about security, this is a security story, education, et cetera. And I hear you kind of saying, the technology is going to come and go. It's important for the Jewish people to be clear on what their mission is, where they're going, and then they can think about that technology in the context of assimilating it into Shabbat, in the context of assimilating into the Jewish community, and then you're able to clearly know how to be in conversation with that technology because you know what you're going for. And then one of the examples I heard you give was one feature of Shabbat is that it feels like a different day, right? So if we're not going to allow electricity, how do we manage? Is there a way to allow electricity, which is within halacha in a traditional home? And I have a kosher lamp, by the way. But certainly, it's a different day, right? I'm running around the house on Friday afternoon, turning on the Shabbat lamps and turning off the bedroom lights and making sure everything's right. And if we leave the light on, we're sleeping with the light on that week, that kind of thing. And so I hear you kind of saying, like, we need to know what we know first about Judaism or about this individual aspect of Judaism, and then we can absorb it. I love that. That's super cool.
And I think that's where a lot of the strength of religion in the 21st century lies. It's not necessarily rabbis or other Jewish leaders saying like, well, I'm going to take on the role of the technologist or the therapist or some other existing role. It's rather to ask these larger questions about what does it mean to live a good life? What does a good family environment look like? What does a good community environment look like? Those kind of core questions of, let's start with what we understand a good existence to be, and then think about all the different trends in the world that are impacting that life, and how are we going to adapt to those things or push back against those things or develop those things further. Actually isn't any other really good space in society that helps people think about those questions directly. And so I think that remains a kind of core responsibility of Jewish leaders today.
Got it. It's interesting. So my instinct was to ask you, what is Shabbat going to look like in the future? But I'm not going to ask you that. I'm going to ask you instead, let's think about these technologies and what does Judaism have to say about them? Because right, we talked about how do you bring them into Judaism, but now you're saying a little bit around, how do you bring Judaism to them, is what I hear you saying a little bit. So let's start with kind of, I'll call it the hottest or most popular one that everyone's talking about right now, which really was any Shabbat table I was at before October 7th, this is what we were talking about, and obviously it's shifted since then a little bit, or a lot, which is artificial intelligence and LLM. So first, just for our audience, kind of give us a framing of what those things are, and then let's talk about them.
Great. So artificial intelligence is a kind of software that is able to act like a human in certain ways. It acts in a way that we perceive as being intelligent. One of the engines that runs many artificial intelligence systems, not all of them, but the one that has kind of risen to prominence, is this thing called a large language model, which basically, to really, really simplify this, ingests huge amounts of information, right? Like millions and millions and millions of documents or images or anything else, and figures out statistically, if I have a given word, what probably should be the next word in that sentence. And that simple process actually allows systems, if they have enough data, to write entire essays, to develop coherent arguments, to be able to translate, to do all kinds of things that seemingly only human beings could do, but it turns out these machines can do as well. Now, because they're operating probabilistically, there are certain errors that tend to come up. These systems tend to hallucinate, that is the technical term, in that they will make up information that seems like it might be true, but isn't necessarily true. And because of the way they're designed, they'll be very confident that they are right, even if they're not right. But this is a set of technologies, a set of softwares that have really risen to prominence. They've been in development for a long time, but since the rise of the publicly available OpenAI ChatGPT 3.5 and then on to version 4, I think this has become something that people are starting to imagine and actually are using in their day-to-day work.
Great, and I'll just give a couple examples just to think about. So, two examples that come to mind for me. We just had Purim, and I was with my kids, and we asked ChatGPT, tell the Purim story as though it were a Pinkalicious story, right? And that's a child's book that my kids like, and so they were able to. Esther was Pinkalicious, and Haman was and Peter, her brother, was Mordecai. But it was basically through what it knows, it was able to create a whole new story. And then, a totally different example would be, we're trying to increase our viewership on YouTube for JBS. ChatGPT, tell us what to do, and then it could give you advice. Again, and you're saying the way it has that information is it's fed, the whole internet, for example, or some large quantity of data, which you can, take in very quickly, much quicker than us, obviously. And then it's able to, by seeing what most people have written on a subject, it's able to anticipate or make suggestions. If anyone's written how to increase YouTube viewers, or all of the Pinkalicious text is online as well as the Megillah is online, it can bring those together to do that work.
Exactly. Now, what that means is that if you ask it, please give me the text of, a certain chapter of the Bible, let's say, it may not get it right? Because it may be kind of probabilistically trying to figure out what does this user want without actually just going to the database. Right. And so there's certain circumstances, certain situations where using systems like this can be kind of dangerous, because if you're asking for medical advice, for example, you don't want there to be so much variation. You want to have high confidence that things are right. And so figuring out how to deal with that probability and that error management is one of the things that people who develop these systems are trying to sort out right now.
Got it. And similarly, there's power in what content is given to it, right? So for example, if you, fed it all anti-Zionist information, not to get political here, but just I said we'd put the important and urgent aside for a second, it would give responses that are in that vein. And if if you gave it all Zionist information, it would give responses in that vein. Or you could make rules for it that say, if someone asks a question about this, don't answer, or this is what you say. But certainly, before we even get to what the computers, the AI is doing, what humans choose to feed the AI can shape what the AI becomes.
Right, and getting that recipe right is very hard, because on the one hand, there's a lot of racist, biased, sexist, anti-Semitic content on the internet, and if a computer just read the internet, it may come away with a lot of those biases as well, and in fact, that has happened with previous AI systems. On the other hand, it is possible to overcorrect. This happened with Google's Gemini recently, where you would say, give me an image of I'm trying to think of an example of it, but it would kind of produce images that were kind of like overly diverse in ways that were not plausible to reality, out of a sense of we're trying to correct for some bias. So figuring out the right space that people feel is kind of neutral is important, but it's also a hard problem to solve.
Right. And we're basically, like, you and I are feeding AI as we speak, because we're creating a video which will be available online, and AI machines out there will be absorbing the information we take, and will be it'll be shaping the way that they behave.
Possibly, but there's ongoing litigation right now about exactly what kinds of data these systems are allowed to take. The New York Times has sued OpenAI. Other individuals, Sarah Silverman, other actors, other writers, have also kind of expressed real concern that their data is being kind of just sucked up into these systems. And once it is inside of these large language models, which often take tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to develop, it's kind of stuck there. So figuring out how to develop these systems in a way that people don't feel like they have been robbed or they're being plagiarized in all kinds of complicated ways is a problem that the courts are now trying to sort out.
Wow, that's really interesting, right? Like, all this conversation about like what you're feeding them. Is the future of this that like AI becomes God? Like, I remember my friend Avram Lotek, talking about how people treat their phones. Siri is the new God, right? The automated response, which is an early taste of AI on the phones. You can ask a question, any question, whatever it is. I don't know who invented the printing press, and they can respond to you. So suddenly you don't ask God for answers, you ask the computer for answers. As this AI takes in all of our information, is it like a super brain that like reflects all of humanity's digital information, I guess? Is that where we're going?
I've seen that idea floating around for the last few years, and I have to say, it really worries me. It worries me in part because it is essentially a religious idea, but I see it mostly being developed by people who are not sitting within religious communities. And what it tells me is that AI is going to be a religious conversation, whether people who are in religious communities want it to be or not. The fact that God language is already being used, because I think for a lot of people, they have exactly the same response as you, the sense of like, it is all knowing, it is all seeing. Also, it's a little bit opaque, both to us and also even to the developers, a sense of we don't actually know quite why it does what it does, we just know that it seems to work. I think it is very dangerous to think about AI as God. I think within a Jewish context, you can make a pretty strong argument that it is literally idolatrous to suggest that this human-made thing is godlike, but I think it also has real practical implications. If you say that this is a God, part of what you're saying is kind of the buck stops at that thing. You trust it, you don't trust it, and the fact that it is being developed by human developers is kind of beside the point. And I would rather not develop metaphors for AI that leave developers feeling like, well, we don't need to worry about our responsibility because people aren't just going to be paying attention to the machine that we created. I think that's really dangerous.
So what's the metaphor to think about AI?
I think the very best metaphor to think about AI is a child.
AI is a child.
AI is a child.
Okay.
AI is our child, or is humanity's child, in the sense that it is young, but it is going to grow and is going to become powerful, maybe more powerful than us, that there is something of us in it, in the same way that, you can imagine God gave something of God's self to us, as described in the Torah, the idea that human beings are created in the image of God. I think there's something very similar going on between the relationship between human beings and AIs. And maybe most importantly, there is real anxiety, right? Human beings have this anxiety that the thing we've created is going to go off the rails, right? Parents are always concerned, like, is my kid going to do the right thing? Did I give them the right instruction? And like, just to talk about the bias things I said before, there is this sense of it is always watching us. It's imbibing the things that we do, that we say, whether we like it or not.
Right.
And maybe it's going to learn the lessons that we don't want it to learn, right? Your kids are always learning. They're always learning from you. Some of the things they learn from you are not things that you wish they learned from you, but they learn them anyways because you can't really control it, right? So there's a lot of ways in which I think it's actually helpful to imagine AI as a kind of child of humanity.
Wow. So first of all, I love that metaphor. Very, very interesting as someone who tries to take parenting seriously to the best of my abilities, and also is aware of the way outside influences come in and you can't control that. It's very interesting to think about that in comparison to the idea of like trying to create an artificial intelligence machine that's taking everything in, right? You would never say to your child, I want you to be exposed to as much as humanly possible of the whole world, and I'll let you figure out what to do with that. Go swallow everything, right? And that's like, for the most part, that's the popular version of AI, of course. And then there are individual companies that say, we just want to expose this AI to our books and have it give us some advice. But for the most part, we're training AI for as much as possible. Instead of saying, we want AI to only be exposed to Safaria, or just like Rav Soloveitchik, I have no idea what it is, but something where it's like we want to train an AI that just like built of like, these 10 perfect Jewish thinkers who are very, had great character traits, and let it learn from that.
Yeah, although I think that may change as well. I know that there are definitely Jewish organizations who are thinking about what does it mean to train an AI on Maimonides, train an AI on just the Bible, things like that. And what would it mean? Because one of the things AI allows you to do is to speak to a database, to have this massive set of information, and you don't need to kind of do these searches. You can just say, here's what I want to find, tell me what's inside. Imagine you could do that with a Jewish text. Imagine instead of having to kind of comb through everything Maimonides wrote, you could actually just talk to Maimonides. And we have a lot of Maimonides, right? We have not just the books he wrote, we also have his letters. We have a sense of who he was as a person. That could create entirely different relationships to Jewish texts where they kind of come alive.
Wow.
And I think there's something really both exciting and also dangerous there, in part because of this problem of hallucinations. What happens if this AI Maimonides ends up telling you things that Maimonides never said, or maybe is offering you an interpretation of Maimonides that is offered by a later scholar, but is maybe disputed, and maybe Maimonides, would not have agreed about that, or there's some ambiguity. So there's a way in which having those kind of relationships is both exciting, gives you a sense of like this is a living thing,
right,
and at the same time is maybe a little bit overconfident.
Wow. So you have a question, ask Maimonides. Caveat: it's not Maimonides. Don't forget, it's not Maimonides. Right. By the way, which is also true of humans. With due respect to the holiest of the Rebbes for sure, but like I think on average most people, the day you catch them, the time of day, what else is going on in their life, what's on their mind. Like, yes, I think the best of the best are cool, collected, and very great integrity, but often there's some variation in the molecules in their brain at that moment. Yeah. But it's a more extreme version. Wow. Okay, I'm very excited to chat with Maimonides when Maimonides is ready. That's really crazy. It reminds me of there's the metaphor from Rabbi Soloveitchik, the idea of walking into a room and being in conversation. Kind of he comes in exhausted with his students in front of him, and then there's this eternal conversation because everyone who's ever been in Jewish history is also contributing, and it's like a symphony of sounds. And I guess you're saying that we could get to a point where we already use the text of, let's say, Maimonides and Nachmanides, and we say, look, they're in conversation, they're responding to one another. But you're saying that we can get to a point where we can almost we could have a conversation here at JBS where we could invite Maimonides and Nachmanides and Rashi and Rav Soloveitchik, and the bot of each of them could be at this table. And
you could literally bring that to life, right? You could bring that you could have that symphony, have instances of those top 20 scholars say like, I want you to talk about this, and just kind of watch them go.
Right. Amazing. All right. Beautiful. But then, okay. But let's. I'm in my ET. Aspirational, exciting phase, but I want to also take a couple of minutes. And you mentioned a few things that scare you, but I think another movie I saw growing up was Terminator 2, and I think that was the first adult movie that I saw in theaters, let's call it. And I went with my cousins with Arnold Schwarzenegger, where the future is very bleak, that the machines kind of take over the world at a certain point. I think in that movie I think it's for their own benefit, but I guess today people might say what if AI decides that humans are not good for the planet and it's time to get rid of them, or humans should be in hamster cages and running to create power supply for the planet, but and enslave us, all those kinds of things. What is the do you buy that? What's the dark side of the AI?
Yeah, I think those are real questions. I know there is a kind of internal debate among AI experts about how seriously to take this question of existential risk, where there's some people saying, yes, AI is that dangerous, it will kill literally every person on the planet, and some people say that's kind of a fantasy. I don't think there's anybody who thinks it is a totally ridiculous idea. I think there was a question of what is the time horizon on which to take this seriously, but everyone takes it seriously. And I think even AI developers are openly speaking about AI as being in the same category as something like nuclear weapons in its potential to cause massive harm. And so you can think about the kinds of responses that Jews have had to things like nuclear weapons, where there has been a response. I don't know that Jewish leaders themselves, just based on our numbers, are going to be the ones to say like, yeah, we're going to denuclearize the planet or get rid of all AI on the planet or something like that, even if that's something that you wanted to do. But at the same time, I think being able to put your foot down and say, either these are technologies that have to move much more slowly, or there are certain kinds of implementations of these technologies which are not acceptable, are the kinds of messages that can come from religious leaders that I think could catch fire in ways that people say, oh, maybe this is an idea that I should get behind as well. Because I think one thing we definitely see right now in the way that the public is taking in AI is a sense that they're very excited about it. A lot of people are already using AI in their daily lives, whether they know it or they're not. And they also want it to slow down. There's a sense that AI is moving just too fast for people to react properly to it and to develop their internal sense of what they want to come out of it. And so I think to the degree that religious leaders can say, let's push on the brakes, or to give people the space even to say, it is okay if you're uncomfortable with the technology that people are telling you is the future. Because I think like if you think about something like smartphones, right? People have to use smartphones more or less today, right? You kind of can't get out of it. If you say no to smartphones, in some ways you're saying no to the 21st century, and people find that unacceptable, right? And so having religious communities being able to say, you know what, within this space, we're going to make it acceptable to say no to X technology that maybe you as an individual would not have been able to say no to, I think is a really important power of religious communities even today.
Super interesting. Yeah, I think the example of smartphones came to me immediately. We had Jonathan Haidt in a program with Tikva a couple of weeks ago on JBS, where he kind of talked about the damage that's being caused by middle schoolers and teens using their smartphones and social media, and that feels like an example where the tech companies were just 100 miles an hour, right? Their goal obviously is, by law, is to increase profit. That's what they're trying to go for. They're not a nonprofit. The government is like, just figuring out how to regulate AOL. It's a little bit behind, not with full respect to those who serve our country and the government. And then you have families kind of left holding the bag because suddenly, you're trying to walk that back and have a conversation about how to navigate a world where it's impossible. It's too late. And so, is this just a mistake that's like inevitable? That like the same, I like your framework, which is a little bit around, it's not going to come from the tech companies. It's not going to come from the government fast enough. So, maybe individual strong communities, such as a Jewish community, can come out in front. But it seems so hard to imagine an expectation of spiritual leaders to have the level of sophistication that, for example, you have without, writing a dissertation on these things and studying it all day, to be in a position to really opine. Which is why it's interesting. I wonder, I don't know if you know this, but I'm curious if you do, which is like when we chose, for example, that electricity didn't feel right and put our foot down. Was that a time that there was just more Jewish authority so they could put their foot down, or they were well-versed enough immediately to say, no, we're not going to do this? 'Cause I've seen very few communities really put their foot down on phones. I think it's changing, but it's like very much reactive, not ahead of schedule. There was no like, oh, Jews used electricity on Shabbat for 20 years and then we realized it was a bad idea. So has it happened in the past, and is it practical to happen now?
Yeah, those thought experiments are so interesting, right? I also think about things like, there's a Jewish attitude towards IVF. What happens, what if IVF had developed 20 years earlier or later? What would the Jewish response look like based on the kind of authority that rabbis and other Jewish leaders had in those moments? I don't know, it's hard to answer. I think it's certainly the case that Jewish authority, rabbinic authority today, is diminished from what it had been previously. At the same time, I feel like this is a kind of like use it or lose it situation, where part of the reason why authority is diminished is a sense of we're not sure that these are the people who are going to lead us because they're not saying the things that seem like the messages we want for the future. And so I think there is a way in which one might follow the other. It is probably true that you're not going to have a generation of Jewish leaders who are all just as well versed in technology as the technologists themselves. But I don't think you need exactly that. I think you can stay well informed. I think there's certainly ways in which Jewish leaders decide to inform themselves on issues of foreign policy or issues of domestic policy. You could imagine if this becomes a priority, there are people who would do that. And also, part of what it means is kind of attracting people to Jewish leadership itself who find this stuff interesting already, right? This is also kind of supply and demand problem. If people think what it means to be a Jewish leader is to lead on things that are not technology, then it's going to be hard to kind of retrain those leaders to do the technology conversations as well.
Great. So then I guess, let's say, a bunch of Jewish leaders, they watch this conversation, they're moved, they're ready to get involved with this. It's the electricity one on Shabbat seemed a little bit easier because it was a little bit of a black or white to do it or not do it, where we said kind of it's very difficult to imagine a community saying, and there are communities that either don't have smartphones or have kosher phones and do something along those lines. I remember one of the first things that stuck with me around artificial intelligence was when the Amazon, when you speak to it, is it the Echo or whatever before
Alexa.
that? Alexa, thank you. That I remember someone, either a post or reading somewhere, or someone saying it's really important to speak to Alexa respectfully, because in that case it was a parenting advice. It was kind of your children are going to see you speaking to Alexa, and if you speak disrespectfully to Alexa and you make jokes and you yell at Alexa, that kind of thing, you're setting a model for your kids. So that to me, I felt like there's Torah there. There's some kind of you're helping me navigate. Again, it's not talking about whether or not we should have Alexa. We kind of skipped that because Alexa was everywhere. It was kind of how should you behave around Alexa.
Yeah.
So is it we need to be having more conversations about how to interact with this technology, or is it we need to get in front of this and push for certain policies around the technology?
I think it's a combination of both. Some of the leadership that's needed is kind of doing public space work, writing the op-eds, being in conversation with representatives, things like that. Sometimes it means being in conversation with the tech leaders themselves, especially people who are kind of situated closer to those tech leaders, making sure that you're up on not just the technologies which have just emerged, but the ones that are in the pipeline, so you have a say in terms of how those are developed. Some of it means developing internal community policies, right? Maybe you can't decide how AI is used in American life, but you can decide how it's used in your synagogue or it's how it's used in your school. I know that that's the kind of conversation happening now around smartphone use, right? What does our state do? What does our school do? And I think those are all important petri dishes for thinking about what these responses are. Part of what motivates this is a sense of, I don't think the public actually knows what it wants yet. For a lot of these questions, they're happening kind of top down. You have technologists who know what they want. You have policy experts who know what they want. You have a selection of lawmakers who know what they want. But I think the public is kind of left out of it, having a sense of I'll just do what I have to do based on the technologies that are available and what's socially acceptable. I think part of what that petri dish model allows you to do is you can have communities that really have those conversations about what do we think is acceptable and what do we not think is acceptable. I'll give you a good example of this where I think it's going to come up in the next few years. Thinking about being able to train an AI model on a small set. So you could train it on something like Maimonides or Rashi, or you could train it on your parent, a deceased parent or a deceased relative. Let's say there is a parent who is no longer alive. You want your kids to be able to have an experience of that parent. So you take all the text messages and all their pictures and everything you have of them, you put them in an AI model and you say, okay, here is your AI grandfather. Now, there are some people who hearing that are going to be like, that is revolting. That is terrible. I would never do that. And some people say, you know what? I would love to do that because I really miss that person and I would love my kids to have a sense of that person. Now, in terms of the data, there's not actually that much of a difference between training your data on your parent and training data on Maimonides, right? It's really just more data. But I think there's a kind of internal conversation to have about, is that acceptable? Is that something that we want? What does it mean, perhaps, to say that this is the kind of thing which is okay if you're learning Torah, but not okay if you're trying to talk to a deceased relative? Those are also the kind of questions that you could answer on a global scale, like should these companies exist, the companies that make these things exist? But it's also kind of a personal question of, is it acceptable for me as an individual to introduce that into my life, into my family?
Wow, what do you think?
I'm still out. I think like everyone else, I'm like still thinking it through. I'm conflicted in part because I really want to see those AI developed Torahs. And at the same time, I'm trying to understand what it is about that kind of internal revulsion that I feel and a lot of other people feel, and whether there's something to that about my experience of death, whether it feels like it's kind of cheating death in some way. What does it mean to kind of give up a sense of, my parents are alive, Baruch Hashem, but what does it mean to kind of give up a sense of one's own ability to tell stories about your family to a machine? And I think that itself is a little bit scary, right? Like you're no longer the sole arbiter of what your relatives were like, but rather there's a machine doing that as well.
Right. It reminds me of like on Shabbat. It used to be if you had a discussion with someone and disagreed about it, you convinced them, and now it's like, well, I can Google it. So Shabbat's like the one time where you can still exist in a world where there isn't an answer waiting on a machine.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Can I respond to something else that you said also? So in terms of like speaking nicely to the machines, I think there's something to that as well. And I think this is an area where actually Jewish thought has quite a lot to contribute. There is a conversation in society right now around, does it make sense to think about AI as a person? And we're having that conversation not just around AI, but around fetuses, right? Around abortion, and also around animal rights, right? In some instances, does it make sense to think about an animal as having some kind of personhood? A lot of that conversation, as it happens right now, happens through a kind of Christian framework of you're either a person or you're not, you either have a soul or you're not. I think if you look at Jewish texts on this topic, Judaism doesn't have what to say about every issue on AI yet, but I think it actually has a pretty clear message here. And the message is, if something presents itself to you as being a human being, you ought to give it some humanity. Even if you can't kind of like look behind the curtain and say like, yeah, that is a human or that isn't a human, the very fact that it appears to you as human actually matters. And I think this is important for AI because, look, one of the reasons that we develop AIs to seem like us, it's not for no reason. It's because there's a way that we respond to that. And if you have this kind of dual message of, on the one hand, we're developing these AIs to seem like you, to resemble humanities, to have human voices, to have human text, whatever it is, and at the same time, we're telling you, but you don't need to treat it like a human being. That is a very dangerous mixed message, and it's something that we need to carefully guard against.
Wow. I mean, I love your metaphor of the child, right? If you think of AI as your child, it's a totally different approach and mindset. Certainly, you're not going to speak disrespectfully to them, or hopefully not. But you're being very thoughtful about what you feed it, how you speak to it, the model you're putting in front of it. It's a totally different approach. So that resonates deeply. I want to ask you one more on AI, which is, one of the promises / terrible things that people say about AI is that it'll replace the workforce in some way, right? That we're going to have this future where, you thought AI would do all of the computer work. Now AI is also going to do the liberal arts work. It'll do the thinking and speaking and writing and computing, everything. What do you see as the future around how we spend our time in light of AI, and is it good or bad?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, right? And it's one of those questions where you're not going to get an answer from the technology itself, because if you just look to the technology, what's going to happen is you have people working the same amount of time. Maybe their productivity is up a little bit. Maybe the AI does that for them, but their tasks are just going to be different. They're just going to be working the same amount, and maybe they'll have to take on the additional burden of retraining. I think you need an outside force to kind of come in and say, life is not just about work. Life is about other things too. And I think there are important Jewish messages there. I think there's a Jewish history in America especially of kind of developing the idea that life is about being with family, being with friends, being with community. The push towards having a 5-day work week, of having like a 2-day weekend, Jews are involved in that conversation, and I see an echo of that conversation in the current debate around AI, where I think it is important for religious leaders to actually say something about the way that people ought to spend their time. I think this is an area where I don't know that religious leaders realize that they have a real power here. There was a book that came out last year, I want to say, about why people stop going to church. And one of the things it says is people stop going to church because they're busy, right? They don't have time. You have both parents working. That's really hard, and so church just kind of gets squeezed out. What I think that kind of misses is a sense of like, but the church, religious organizations have the ability to actually push back on the kinds of lifestyles that lead people to feel like, actually, I don't have time for church anymore. And so I think taking an active role in those scenarios is actually quite important.
Wow, it's so interesting. So bringing a couple of these ideas together, we talked about right now it feels like October 7th is like the front lines of the Jewish fight. Let's use the metaphor of like, that's the fence to protect the Jewish people, let's say, right? You're building that fence and you want to make sure that no one's coming in and breaking it. But I hear you saying a different thing, which is, also at stake in a longer range version is, the very game we're playing, what the house looks like of the whole world, not just the Jewish house, right? And to the extent people are shifting what that looks like, that affects everyone. Yeah. And that it's not the machines are outside of us and are going to influence the way we live our lives. It's that the vision of what the world should look like should drive how we raise the machines. And if we raise the machines for a world where, just to use that example, we work 4 days a week and rest 3 days, or as my Rebbe in Yeshiva, Michael Hatton, used to tell me, we're all sitting in a Beit Midrash learning Torah all day because we don't have to be productive in the same way. Maybe that's the beautiful future that Jewish people imagine. Then you need to actually be at the forefront of shaping the raising of the children, because that's what's going to actually shape the way we're living.
Yeah. And I'll say, look, you can look at things like Shabbat and electricity and say, like, Jews did it right. There's also places where we do it wrong, right? I think a really good example is Hanukkah, right? Hanukkah is supposed to be a holiday that's about kind of celebrating, the miracle of the Maccabees, but there was a decision basically around the same time about whether the menorah, the thing you light on Hanukkah, should just be literal candles or maybe should be electrified. And rabbis basically decided, we're going to keep it just being candles. And the result today, if you go down any American street, is you have in December people who have their little dinky menorahs in the window, and then all the Christians with their lawns full of all kinds of fantastic electrified ornaments, because Christians also had a kind of tradition of candlelighting around the Christmas tree. They decided to electrify, Jews didn't, and the result is this idea of spreading the miracle of Hanukkah ends up being totally overshadowed by the electrified Christmas lawn.
I thought you were going to say we missed it because Hanukkah became about presents as a way to copy Christmas.
Oh, that's its own thing.
I didn't realize you were going to say it was about using candles. That's super interesting. I wasn't expecting that, because for me, I feel like the only time I ever look at fire is Shabbat candles or Hanukkah candles. I'm not even around fire other than that. So, I feel like we had guests this week. We had guests this year around Hanukkah, and one of them, she's from Israel, just sat in front of our menorah, like praying and focusing on the candles. So for me, it's like that would never happen if it was like lights outside our house. But you're saying around, if the goal is to publicize the miracle, we went very small there instead of big.
And ironically, I think the rules are kind of the wrong way. Shabbat candles, not to get too technical, you don't have to have literal physical Shabbat candles. If you only have a light bulb, you can, say the blessing on Shabbat candles over a light bulb too. That's totally fine. But even though that is not a mitzvah commandment that is supposed to be about celebrating a miracle publicly. Whereas for Hanukkah candles, people are strict about, no, it's not electric, it has to be literally fire.
Interesting, all right. That's super interesting. So I know that you're a Jewish historian and Jewish technology. Give me some other moments, like what's another one that you could think of in terms of like a moment where Judaism encountered technology in that way?
Can we talk about Pesach?
Yes, let's talk about Pesach.
Great. Okay, let's talk about Pesach. Okay. Yeah. So I think
Pesach being Passover.
Yeah, yes. Passover. So one thing that's been on my mind recently is thinking about the way that we make matzah. Right. So
the way we make matzah.
The way we make matzah.
Okay.
Matzah is the oldest Jewish food, right? Unless you count the whatever fruit it was in the Garden of Eden, right? Like it is the oldest important Jewish food.
And predates gefilte fish.
And you can believe that the people in Egypt making matzah as they are leaving Egypt are making it by hand.
Yeah.
And for literally millennia, that is how matzah is made. It is made by hand. In many communities, especially in Eastern Europe, it is made by often the poor, made by widows and orphans. It's a little bit like the Girl Scout cookies at the time, in a sense of like, it's something that is given that people kind of buy both as a religious obligation, but also as a kind of charity. And so it occupies that really important role in society.
So I did not know that at all. And
it's
also
amazing, right?
No one's ever compared Girl Scout cookies to matzah before. That's another one I'm taking with me. Thank you.
Maybe it's because one of them tastes much better.
Exactly.
So in the 19th century, you have this industrialization. one of the things that gets industrialized is food production, right? And so in the 1850s, 1860s, you start to develop the first matzah making machines. Originally, they're very simple, but people start thinking, hey, maybe we should use those machines instead of using human labor. And so they developed those machines. There is an intense debate at the time whether it is okay to use machines to make matzah. That actually has a lot of important parallels to the conversation that we have around AI, right? There's these questions of, are we taking people's jobs? Is it going to be just as good? If it's not as good, how are we going to know? Because these are factories that we don't have as much insight into. And so they have the debate, and as may happen with AI, the machines win because it's cheaper, right? It's so much easier to make matzah with a machine than it is to have human labor. And so the machines win, and then machines get better and better and better. In America, the real kind of forefront of that is Manischewitz, the Manischewitz company. Manischewitz, I think people don't realize how much of a role Manischewitz plays in the development of machine-made matzah. The person who kind of really built up the company in America is inviting rabbis into his factory and saying, like, I want you to totally believe that this is kosher matzah. Any rabbi can come at any time, investigate my plant line. It's all going to be kosher. It's all going to be kosher for Passover. Totally fine. So they do that, and the machines basically win. And the result is that this millennia-old practice of human beings making matzah really falls by the wayside. If you ask basically any person who's going to be observing Passover, did you make your own matzah? They'll be like, are you insane?
Right.
What kind of person makes their own matzah? What kind of person makes matzah? Right? Like it's not a person job anymore. It's a machine job. So the machines went to such an extent that the idea of human-made matzah is kind of marginal. That's not to say that human-made matzah doesn't exist. It does exist. It is much more expensive. And there's some people who kind of go out of their way to buy that human-made matzah. However, in order to compete, it is made on the kind of scale that needs to at least try to mimic the Manischewitz as well. And so I think it's a great example of, we made this choice to kind of go the machine route. We ended up losing a kind of practice of making matzah, like literally imitating the thing that Jews did as they were leaving Egypt. It's not something that most Jews experience anymore because of that. And what I find, like, just kind of the cherry on top for this year is that it happens to be that this year, Manischewitz did a kind of total rebrand. They decided, we want more people to buy our matzah. We want people to have a different image of what matzah is. And so now they have these bright orange boxes of matzah. And on the orange box of matzah, there is a picture of a person making matzah by hand. As to say, we are the face of tradition, when Manischewitz is exactly the opposite. They are the face of industrialization. They should be proud of that. I think they should be proud that they were able to make matzah cheaply and available to everyone.
Right. But
there is a kind of amnesia, and that amnesia is not uncommon when it comes to technology. Technology has a tendency to replace its predecessors, and I think one of the things that Judaism brings to the table for technology questions is this sense of, yes, you can embrace the future, but don't forget the past. The past remains important and remains relevant in certain situations. So I think I just love that story personally.
So that's why Manischewitz has the picture on the cover, so we don't forget the past.
That's right. They're a constructed past of what they were like.
Wait, and just one note on there. So when I also hadn't heard before you said it, this idea that matzah was made by widows and the poor, I guess as a way for them to make money as well. So, we call matzah lechem oni, the bread of the poor. I always thought that was because it didn't have time to rise and it was rushed. But is it also literally it was bread made by the poor to be sold in communities?
That's interesting. I had not thought of that. It might be a coincidence, but I think maybe that's one of the things that made people feel like the role fit. Right, it made sense for it to be something that was sold by widows and orphans.
Wow, and even today, I'm certainly hanging circles where, look at my handmade shmura matzah. This is handmade. This is handmade. But I wonder. I don't want to speak on behalf of people. I wonder if that's driven by the fact that it's made by hand as opposed to machine. But certainly, it's lost that meaning of it was made by widows and children, those who are in need. That's long gone.
Yeah.
Wow, very interesting though. Okay, fine. All right, I want to shift a little bit to talk about. There's kind of a few big areas. We won't get to all of them today. We talked about AI. I think the two that are on my mind, and maybe we'll play briefly in them, is virtual reality or augmented reality, and then biotechnology. I'll ask two questions, and I'll let you just run with however you want to run with it. The first is, augmented reality is the idea that instead of kind of putting on some sort of mask where you imagine yourself in a totally different world, now in recent weeks the other kind of popular thing was Apple's, what's it called?
Vision Pro.
Vision Pro, which is you're wearing some kind of glasses that allow you to see kind of mini screens within it and add texture to what you're looking at, but you're looking at the same thing. So I'm wearing the glasses, I actually see David Zvi, but it tells me, I don't know, every conversation I've ever had with David Zvi, and I can also watch a football game to the left of David Zvi's head, and I also have a reminder I have to call so-and-so when I'm done talking to David Zvi. All those things are happening at once. That's, let's call it the AR part of the future. And then the second part of the future is the idea of biotechnology, the idea of using technology somehow like being absorbed into our bodies. I think for me, I always, when I was younger, hearing about this was always like, well, the Jews are not going to get chips in their bodies because of Shabbat. Or the Jews will, in the same way we have a refrigerator that has the ability to, have a setting that the light turns off, or an oven that has a setting the oven can stay on, that we're going to get special, nanotechnology inside our body that's going to say, you can't regulate my heart rate, and you can't, tell me how to feel or what to think on Shabbat. That's a lot there, but just, swim a little bit with me in the time that we have around VR/AR, virtual and augmented reality, and then also biotechnology.
Oh boy. Okay.
Big one.
Let's talk about virtual reality.
A few minutes, yeah.
Yeah. So for virtual reality, there's something that I've noticed in the last few years, especially around COVID, where I think it's fair to say COVID accelerated the process of virtualization that happened in so many fields, right? People were already kind of moving their shopping from in-store to online, their social experiences from in-store to online, dating, all kinds of things.
So where we got used to being at home to be in the world, is what you're basically saying. Right. Whether it's shopping or playing or whatever it is, I don't need to leave my couch to be in the world.
Right. And even though, for work, I think there is a push to kind of go back to the office, it's never going to be the way it was before the pandemic. Synagogues also virtualized. Virtual spaces in general virtualized. My synagogue has like a Zoom camera set up in the sanctuary.
We air Central Synagogue and Hampton Synagogue services every Shabbat, which it's that.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's amazing. People have the ability to access it from home. Keep going.
But the physical synagogue still matters.
Right.
And what has been so striking to me is that basically all attempts to fully virtualize prayer spaces have failed. There are like a few exceptions, but I think they're kind of exceptions that prove the rule. They get written up, there's like an article or two about them every once in a while. But the idea that people are going to gather to worship virtually, not just in Judaism, but other religions as well, really has not taken off. I think that should tell us something. I think it should tell us something about the continued importance of physical spaces. Not to say virtual reality is never good, it has lots of important points, but that physical space is actually a value. And it's a kind of value that we've kind of, I think, discovered accidentally. If it's the only option, then you don't need to say it's a value. But if you have an option between, do I choose to spend my time in physical reality, virtual reality, some combination between the two, augmented reality, that physical reality actually still matters. There are things you can do more easily in physical reality than you can do in other kinds of spaces, and so that continues to be important. I could imagine the future in which one of the key messages that religious leaders send is a message of being in those spaces is something you should value. You should think about how much time you're spending in physical spaces with other people. You should make sure that doesn't diminish too much. It also matters for communities, right? Think about all the ways in which synagogues, other religious spaces don't just exist in a vacuum. They exist within whatever urban, suburban, rural situations they're in. They are affected by all of the politics and the dynamics in those spaces. And I think it is often easy to kind of have those two things be separate. Like, I drive to my shul, but like I'm not really connected to the community around it. I can imagine a kind of push towards, no, we're rooted in these places. Those places really matter. And thinking not just about the physical sanctuaries, but also about the communities in which they're situated, that is a kind of emergent religious value. So I'll say that about virtual spaces. In terms of bioethics, I think this is one that it is important to develop religious policies around these sooner rather than later. The ability to do genetic editing in particular, the ability to affect people's genomes and the genomes of their progeny is only going to increase. It is already quite cheap to use a system like CRISPR, which is one of the kind of the most prominent systems to directly edit a genome.
What do you mean when you say edit a genome? Like my kid's taller now, I changed their color eyes, they can fly? Like what do you say more? Like,
Well, maybe not flying, but yes, but being able to be taller, different color eyes.
like before the baby's born, you're
Right, you're deciding when the fetus is being developed, that it is going to be developed in a certain way based on the genetic information.
And you can do that today. You can just be like, hey,
It's been done. It's been done. I think in 2017 or 2018, there were a couple of twins born in China with their genome edited in advance so that they would be immune or not as susceptible to a certain disease. Right. So some of the uses for these are entirely therapeutic.
Right.
And I think because of that, these technologies are very, very attractive. Right. People who maybe would not live if they did not have these edits, or people who would live but their lives would be miserable. But I think there is a kind of blurry boundary between like what is a therapeutic use and what is an enhancement, right? Is it okay to make my kid smarter or more attractive or taller?
Right.
And how do you kind of find the line there? That is very tricky to do. I think it is important to kind of think through those questions now, in part because it is a technology that is almost ready to kind of like be available for prime time, be available for commercial use. It's not quite there yet. And so there is a space now to actually develop guidelines for its use instead of being in the situation that I think a lot of Jewish leaders were in around AI, where it suddenly popped up on the front page of whatever newspaper they read, and they say, oh, I have to think about this now. So better to think about these problems of bioethics before they become real, before they're like kids born and you have to ask those questions, than after the fact.
Wow. Right, and you can imagine, the ups and downs. And it's funny, like I feel like a generation ago was like a nose job, right? And now we've come like much further, and we're saying we could really significantly change things. And of course, often the knock you hear on that is that it's really hard to reach a state of happiness when there's this, you can imagine all the things that you could change about someone.
Right.
And on the other hand, but if it makes them happy to be a couple inches taller, to have green eyes instead of blue eyes, blah, blah, blah. It's very interesting.
And what's tricky is that behind those acts is a kind of assumption about what is better or worse in society. It's better to be taller. It's better to look a certain way. I know people in the disability rights community are very aware of this, right? Like, what does it say that we are genetically editing people in order to eliminate certain kinds of character traits or certain kinds of conditions? And so there's a real concern about the way that we end up valuing or devaluating human beings on the basis of the edits that we do.
Beautiful. Okay, wow, David Zvi, it's like amazing to chat with you. I think my biggest takeaway from this experience is recognizing that we have to shift away from, part one is, yes, keep, Shabbat or the equivalent. You want to have you want to not just be swept away with technology and create those spaces for you to have some distance from technology to actually like be present. But that's absorbing technology into Shabbat. The other piece that I hear you saying is we have to think about how Judaism wants to influence where the world is going, and we have to think about it now. I said at the beginning it was important and not urgent, but you're saying it's important and it's pretty urgent. And so, being really clear on what we're going for, we, the Jewish people, but something along those lines, but having a vision of what society should look like, and then using that to train AI to think about how we interact with virtual reality and to think about how we build biotechnology. It starts with us having a vision for where we want to go and then bringing it to those spaces instead of them shaping us.
Yeah, exactly.
David Zvi, thank you so much. Really such an honor.
Thank you. This is great.
All right.
Thanks.